Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of A Second Chance Stories of Young Offenders. We're your hosts, Callista Lynn.
And Sophia Luisi, and today we've got yet another awesome narrative for you guys.
We're honored to introduce you to a distinguished and award-winning professor of social welfare at UCLA, one of the top universities in the country, and a leading expert in the field of youth justice. Dr. Abrams has authored multiple books, including Compassionate Confinement and Everyday Desistance, and her work has made a significant impact on our understanding of the criminal legal system. Please welcome Laura Abrams.
Hi, Laura. We just wanted to begin by saying we are extremely grateful that you took the time to be in our podcast, and we're so excited to hear from you today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here from UCLA, the number one public university in the country.
Of course. So to kick things off, could you share a bit about your background and what initially drew you to the field of youth justice?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, I always start by saying what brought me to this world and this ideas in my field was doing direct work with young people. I was a social worker. I've been a group home worker. I've worked in residential treatment. And so prior to getting my doctorate in social welfare, I had numerous experiences working directly with system impacted youth, which is like a newer term, but we would call youth then, more like institutionalized youth or delinquent youth. And so kind of through my journey in the social work world and in direct service, it brought me to a place of really seeing how young people got trapped into systems that they couldn't really get out of. So once we brought youth, say, into a residential treatment center, not only did they get really worse, sometimes they were over medicated, sometimes they would run away and then get picked up by the police. So it felt like there wasn't really a way out. After that time, when I worked at a residential home and I went and got my master's in social work, I was looking for broader solutions. This was in the mid-90s, but actually the conditions for youth were getting worse. There was the crack epidemic and underfunding of education and resources. And so by the time I was working more with youth in various systems and doing direct service and case management, it felt like I was just really slapping Band-Aids on larger problems. So I decided at that point to get my doctorate and see if my research could kind of help make a difference.
I can definitely tell that your work has been instrumental in reshaping our perceptions of youth incarceration. So could you provide an overview of your research and the key takeaways from your books?
Yeah. So you mentioned the two books that Compassionate Confinement was the summary of maybe my first 10 years of research. I had observed very closely 3 different correctional facilities for boys, mostly in the Midwest, in Minnesota. And this book was Compassionate Confinement was based on my ethnographic field work in one of those facilities that took place over about 18 months. And so the key takeaway in that book was really trying to understand this idea that kids get worse, right? So we have this prevailing idea that correctional facilities don't necessarily help young people and they recidivate at high rates. And instead of blaming the youth for that, I wanted to see what was happening in those facilities. So I guess there were 3 main lessons. Maybe I could sum it up 3 to 4. Let me see. One was that youth will kind of fake it, so that when you have a residential program that's basically saying you have to own up to being a bad person, you have to own up to all these family problems, you have to dig deeper, the youth would kind of make up stories about their childhoods or about kind of a narrative to fit what the institution wanted. So I thought that was kind of interesting. A second part was that I really pointed out that the same people that have the staff that have the power to confine you or send you to solitary or to extend your stay shouldn't be the ones to provide therapy. Like, you can't have a therapeutic alliance with someone who also has the power to punish you. And I think the third takeaway from that book was that you can do a lot of work while you're incarcerated, and even those who wanted to do the work and get better, so to speak, ended up back in the same community, same family environment. So oftentimes how they wanted to change didn't materialize to a reality. That led me to the next jumping off point for everyday desistance, which was really looking at over 2 to 3 years how young people age out of the system. So the first book was really what happens when you're in the system, and the second one was transitioning to adulthood. And so desistance, the concept of moving away from criminalized behavior over time, the main takeaway from that book was doing a deep dive into how that actually happens for young people, that it's not really a linear path. People can take steps back, they can take steps forward, they can take side steps, but also that it's a really conscious everyday decision to have to navigate and negotiate all of these contours of your identity. For example, your old gang friends or your family members or people that expect a certain set of behaviors from you while you're trying to kind of make it in the non-criminalized world, get a job, go to school, maybe forge a marriage or try to help deal with your children. There were just lots of competing forces that my co-author and I kind of identified as being above and beyond what most young people are asked to do. So, for example, if you're in the 18 to 24 range and you're in college or you're in graduate school or you have a safety net, your life is a lot easier to make mistakes if you're in that setting. If you've come from a criminalized background and you don't have all those elements, and maybe you've been in foster care and maybe you don't have a family to fall back on, little mistakes that young people tend to make are very costly. So now that I have my 2 children are in the 18 to 24 range, and they have a lot of privilege, I can really see even more starkly the difference between what kind of mistakes they're allowed to make and be okay versus kids coming out of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I think with what you just said, I can definitely resonate with your perception on that. And I think it's pretty clear that you have a very deep and thoughtful understanding of youth behavior and mindset. I also think that your work really bridges academia and advocacy together really well. So with that, I just wanted to ask you, how do you manage to balance your roles as a professor, author, advocate, and more? I mean, just having so many roles just seems so difficult and challenging to balance.
Wow. Well, first, thank you for reading my work. I think it's an honor to make a difference. So, I'm really fortunate to have landed at UCLA. Not only am I just in a great community of advocates in Los Angeles and people that I align with in my work, but being at a research university, I've also had a lot of opportunity to do my studies, seek funding, have a platform. So I think the balancing is interesting. When my kids were younger, they're both in college now, it was always a scramble of, trying to get the books written and do the work and be out there doing interviews and in the community and doing my ethnography, and then rushing home to try to, be a mom, and teach and do everything else. So I'm not gonna lie, it was not an easy time. But I'm really passionate. You're right. I'm very passionate about this work, and and things like your podcast elements that are telling these stories. It's really important because there's so many negative stereotypes about youth in the system. Sorry, young people in the system. I'll go back because of my phone ring. There's so many stereotypes of young people in the system. And so these stories are great counter narratives, right? Just to help us understand more why youth get entrapped in these systems and how they can get out.
It definitely is a big play when we have like systems like this, like podcasts and all these social media platforms. So I really understand like what you were saying with that. And it also really sounds like you know your stuff, obviously, and that you've been
Thank
doing
you.
this for a while now. Your dedication to this cause is truly commendable. So could you share some of your most valuable lessons that you've drawn from your extensive experiences in the field of corrections and youth justice?
Yeah. So I guess if I had to summarize, maybe some broader lessons, I think one big piece of this is that for most young people or even young adults, like the threats of punitiveness or, if you do this, you're gonna, you're gonna face these consequences. It doesn't necessarily work that well. I don't know if it works that well for adults either, but I don't think young people are always thinking necessarily immediately about the consequences of the actions that they're taking. So our orientation in the whole youth justice system toward correcting behavior through punishment or correcting behavior through therapy, it kind of assumes something's wrong with the young person. And in many aspects, these are just young people trying to survive and adapt in their environment. So they might be using strength that they have. They might be using connections that they have. They might be operating for survival, right? And so sometimes I think that this isn't really a popular argument, but that's okay. That the idea of correcting the young person, fixing that young person, isn't always the right orientation to the system. We don't build enough on young people's strengths and what they are doing well. Do they care about their family? They care about their community. They care about their peers. Like, why aren't we working with those elements? We tend to try to instead diagnose them with either a mental health disorder or some kind of criminogenic dysfunction. I don't necessarily agree with that aspect. Another big takeaway from my work is that I do think that policies can make a difference in how we shape human behavior and how we look at crime and how we look at delinquency. So one of my areas that I've been working on for the last 7 years or so is the idea that we shouldn't prosecute young children. And so I was part of a group that helped to advocate to set an age of juvenile jurisdiction at 12 in California. And so that anyone 11 or below cannot be prosecuted now for a youth offense in the juvenile delinquency court. And that's huge. I mean, you're already then taking out that whole group of people from being maybe exposed to the harshness of the system or to having to go on trial. So I think policies that are trying to curb the use of the system, policies that are trying to eliminate harsh sentences, eliminate the school to prison pipeline, they do matter. So I think in addition to working with youth directly, we have to also keep our eye on what's happening on the policy front.
Yeah, I really think that's amazing. And I really love how empathetic you are about, these young individuals and how you put yourself in their shoes and how you're really just able to see past the surface and what is shown on the front. Um, Actually, just going back to your writing, can you go
Yeah.
into depth about the specific pieces of your writing, excluding the book? And like that would include like your studies, chapters, various studies done, etc. And I take it you brought about change by authoring a bill?
Yeah. So in in 2017, 2016, around then, my colleague and I, she's a pediatrician at UCLA, Dr. Barnard, I'll just call her Liz because that's what I call her. The real doctors, they get to be called doctor, right? So Liz and I were thinking about this idea that California didn't have a minimum age, and we were concerned about that, given that California is generally a pretty progressive state in terms of legislation. So we started to do some research on this concept. We saw that the United Nations at that time recommended that no young person under 12 should be involved in the juvenile court. Now they recommend 14, but back then it was 12. And we also looked at the data and saw that about 600 or so, between 600 and 700 kids under age 12 were prosecuted in California a year, and including an age 5 we saw, and one kid age 5, which is just unbelievable, really, when you think about a kindergartner, right, sitting in a courtroom. I mean, totally inappropriate. So we became concerned. We started to do some research, and we partnered with some advocates at Children's Defense Fund, National Center for Youth Law, and in working in tandem with the advocacy group and doing some legal research and some writing, we were able to finally help author a bill that extended those protections to children under 12 and changed the California Welfare and Institutions Code so that youth under 12 were excluded. So it took 2 years. It was a 2-year bill. There was some opposition from prosecutors and DAs and prosecutors and probation chiefs, but eventually it passed. In 2019, it was put into law. So that was kind of exciting.
That is actually really awesome. And I think what you're doing is really impactful. And you've even testified as an expert witness, correct?
Yeah, I have in different circumstances. So mostly now there's a lot of states trying to raise or set a minimum age. So I've provided testimony about what happened in California and about why that's beneficial for children in I think in a couple of different states. And then unrelated to these bills, I have been an expert witness in death penalty appeals cases in California, mostly looking at the life histories of people on death row, why they trying to find areas where perhaps they could have had earlier intervention. Essentially, in these cases, they call upon a social worker or a social historian to kind of look at the life histories of people on death row to help their appeals. So I've done that, I don't know, 5 or 6 times, I think, with different cases.
And how did that affect you personally?
Some background noise. Okay, how did that affect me personally? Very deeply. So to do this work, you look at these life histories, which are always very sad, lots of child abuse, poverty, disabilities, learning disabilities. So you get to see the whole life course history, which is kind of how I do my work anyway. I look at the life course and of folks, and that's a kind of a grounding element in my scholarship as well, is the idea of the life course. So I mean, the first time I did this, I was looking at the histories. I got to know the person through this paperwork, but then actually going to San Quentin, this notorious prison, going to meet with the person, and it's like just sitting in a room one-on-one, talking with them, knowing that they're never going to be out of prison. Maybe they won't be killed in prison, because California is now really not carrying out any death row murders, but I guess executions they call. But it's very humanizing to sit across from someone who knows that you're studying their history and like talk about it, talk about their family, talk about their schooling, their foster care experiences, their friends, how they got involved in crime, how they ended up on death row, all the things that have tried to keep them whole and human throughout these really dehumanizing experiences of living their life in prison. And sadly, one of the people the very first person I was an expert witness for died of natural causes in prison. So that was very sad. I just read about that in the paper. Yeah, it changed me for sure. I know it's not a common experience to go to San Quentin and talk with death row inmates, and I guess I feel very honored to sit in that seat and to be able to understand the range of human experience, from a very free life that I have to a very unfree life that they have.
Yeah, it really does sound like you've had like a lot of different experiences, and like while a lot of them were like positive, some were like really negative as well. But I think, overall, whether they're good or bad experiences, they've shaped you and impacted you and your perspective on things. But I think your international work proves that even more. Can you explain the work you've done out of the States?
Yeah. So around that same time that I was looking at the minimum age stuff, the 2016, 2015, I was on a sabbatical year, and I wanted to kind of see what was going on with youth justice in other parts of the world. So I did some case study work. First, I went to Europe, and I went to Finland and England. Finland, because like some of the Scandinavian systems, they don't have they don't really prosecute young people below 16 or 15. So that was, interesting. So I went, I talked with people who worked in the courts and advocates, and I visited some prisons. And that really impacted me, because I know people talk about Scandinavian exceptionalism and the way that we can never be like them. But the prisons themselves for young adults and youth were just very humanizing, like looked a little bit more like a college dorm to me, where people could cook and do their laundry, and like it was just and they all had video games and TVs, and it just didn't feel like a place of like extreme punishment like American prisons do. So that was really kind of interesting. England was very much more similar to our system, and we're modeled after the British system. And then we also we looked at some youth justice systems in South and Central America, and Belize and Argentina. And I picked these for different reasons that had to do with the research questions that I had. And so, but in under, poorer countries, the conditions of youth confinement were extremely difficult, rough, and kind of like we were maybe 150, 70 years ago, like youth that just had problems at home or running away were combined with youth who had offenses. So it was like unclear what rights youth had in those countries. And yeah, so not large systems of care, but also in this kind of group home model like we used to do more, where youth were mixed with all different kinds of problems. So that work was very interesting. I do think in the US, we tend to just focus on what we're doing, but it always helps to get outside and see that there's other ways possible. So that work has been pretty formative for me, and I hope to do more of it in the future.
That's very interesting, and I think that your insights and experience resonates deeply with our mission to reform the justice system at this podcast. So, looking ahead, what specific changes or advancements are you striving to bring about within the correctional industry and the community it serves?
That's a great question. There's a lot of, I think we're at a crossroads right now. So in the youth justice arena, we've had about 20 years of reform, shrinking the system, trying to have more developmentally aligned services. The youth justice system is about half as populated as it used to be in terms of incarceration or detention from where we were 20 years ago. Since 2000, it's just, been on the decline. There's been a lot of good stuff: alternatives to detention, close to home movement, trauma-informed care, gender-informed care. So I feel like a lot has happened. And it's interesting because that's juxtaposed with, you still have kids who are abused in institutions, you still have kids who are dying in youth prisons, you still have a disproportionate number of Black young people who are in the system. So at the same time, we've had this kind of positive momentum in terms of advocacy, there's also still these big intractable problems. So some people, of course, want to tear it all down. Abolition movement is very strong, and others want to kind of continue on the path of reform. And I personally am not sure what the future holds. I think there will generally be a need to have some type of youth justice system, but I think it can be a much smaller. So I think most youth issues can be dealt with outside the formal system. So for example, running, truancy, that can be dealt with through a more supportive school system. Running away, does that family need help, right? What can be done with the family? Is there something going on at home? Youth drug abuse and addiction, that often leads to arrests. Can we deal with that through the behavioral health or mental health systems? I'm not saying all these things can be solved. I know some of these problems are very complex. But we have to keep our eye on continuing to I think, have the least number of youth involved in the youth justice system as is possible to maintain public safety.
Definitely. And I really think that's a powerful vision for the future. Dr. Abrams, we want to thank you sincerely for sharing your expertise and perspectives with our listeners today. Your work is truly inspiring, and we're honored to have you as a guest on our podcast.
Thank you. Thank you both for your time and your energy and enthusiasm for this topic. I'm excited to listen to your podcast.
Thank you so much. To the listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of A Second Chance Stories of Young Offenders. Until next time, remember that your story is still being written and that there's always hope for a brighter future. See you guys next time.